We are in the book of Job. I hope you got your notes. The notes cover a lot of chapters. I'm feel certain we won't cover it all tonight. Not going to rush, don't need to. So these notes tonight will carry you for several meetings. Last week we talked about Job's three friends. We introduced Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. We kind of talked about their nature, where they came from. Today we get into the discourse. We know that they sat for 7 days with Job. They came from afar. They grieved with him. They tore their robes. It got in the ashes, the things that culture did. They sat for 7 days, and then Job spoke. So where we're picking up tonight is chapter 4, where Eliphaz starts talking and gives his accounting. Eliphaz, as he responds to Job, the first thing we talk about how he approached Job. And we're going to be able to see a difference here because we have Eliphaz, who we believe is the oldest, the elder, and Bildad in the middle, and then Zophar we think was a young man. We see some impetuousness there, some passionate anger that we find a lot of times in young people, whereas Eliphaz seems to be a little more mature, a little moderated. And he starts out often like we do when we're going to talk to somebody, with an approach of praising Job. He talks about Job being one who helped others. It starts in verse 2 of chapter 4. Eliphaz is talking to him. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can help keep from speaking, looking at a situation? And think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you, and you are discouraged. It strikes you, and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? So he starts out being really congenial and supportive to Job, talking about how you have helped many people with your words. You have been a help to them. Now it's your turn. You're under strife. You're discouraged. Will you receive a word like those people received a word from you, is what he's changing. And then he goes right into some of his accusation here, where he says, because of your piety, you shouldn't be dismayed. You shouldn't have a lack of confidence. You have testified how much you trust in the Lord, how well you know the Lord. So that's kind of Eliphaz's first charge to him, is, and that accusation is that how come he is feeling doubtful or discouraged if he knows the Lord as well as he says he knows him. And so he gets right into it, and he goes on in verse 7, consider now who being innocent has ever perished. Where were the upright ever destroyed? So he's saying God always blesses those who follow him. That's what he's saying here. As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. Yep, reap what you sow. At the breath of God they are destroyed. At the blast of his anger they perish. The lions may roar and growl, yet the teeth of the great lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lionesses are scattered. And then he goes into 2 reasons why he is saying these things to Job. One of them he calls a vision. Starting in verse 13, a word was secretly brought to me. So he's feeling like he's received a word from God. My ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, when deep sleep falls on men, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form stood before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can a man be more pure than his Maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with error, how much more those who live in the houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth. Between dawn and dusk they are broken to pieces unnoticed. They perish forever, and are not the cords of their tent pulled up, so that they die without wisdom. So he's claiming he had received a vision here. Many scholars, as they read that, don't really believe it was what we would truly call a vision from God. They think he had a dream, he dreamt some stuff, and in thinking about it, musing over it, he kind of modified it into a vision of the Lord. And one reason we think that is because nowhere in his discord does he say, the Lord said unto me, the Lord showed me. He just says a word was brought to me. It doesn't really testify. Other places in the Bible, when there's a vision, it acknowledges that it's God that brought it. The Lord opened the way to me, opened my eyes. So we don't really, many don't believe. I'm still studying on that, whether it was a true vision, but it doesn't mean it's without merit. And he asks that question, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Certainly not. Can a man be more pure than his Maker? Certainly not. God is overall. He is totally without darkness, totally without error. And then he goes on in verse 19 talking about how much more those who live in houses of clay. That's us. That's a poetic way to talk about us. From dust we were made. Clay is made from dirt, dust. So that's what he's drawing there. We are a body of houses of clay whose foundations are in the dust, which we know that, and who are crushed more readily than a moth, getting under God's hands. God can swipe us away as easily as we may kill a moth. Then he talks about being broken into pieces. And so he first presents this vision that he calls it, this experience, as proof of who God is. Then he goes on, call if you will, but who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Resentment kills a fool, and envy slays the simple. I myself have seen a fool taking root, but suddenly his house was cursed. His children are far from safety. Crushed in court without a defender, the hungry consume his harvest, taking it even from among thorns, and the thirsty pant after his wealth. For hardship does not spring from the soil, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. Yet man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. Boy, that seems to be the truth. Man's born to trouble. So he's presenting these as his argument about the power and the need to worship God. He's building his argument, is what he's doing as he goes along. He makes his appeal after we go over to chapter 5. Let's look at that. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 7 is his observation, but he picks it up in verse 8. The appeal to him. Call if you will, that we just read that. Where am I? Down. But if it were I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. He bestows rain on the earth. He sends water on the countryside. The lowly he sets on high, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He thwarts the plans of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. He catches the wise in their craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are swept away. Darkness comes upon them in the daytime. At noon they grope as in the night. He saves the needy from the sword in their mouth. He saves them from the clutches of the powerful. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts their mouth. And so what he's saying here, he's getting into it. For Job to appeal to God in confessing his sins. All three of these friends are convinced that Job has sinned and needs to confess that before God. Job, of course, is adamant that he has not sinned, to where God has brought all of these upon him because of his sinful nature. He asserts his innocence, as does God. God said he is a great and upright man. But these good friends come, and they just will not believe it. 17:5, blessed is the man whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. And that's a good word there. None of us like discipline. It talks about that in Hebrews. No one loves discipline, but discipline brings about perseverance, patience, all these things. Discipline trains us. For he wounds, but he also binds up. He injures, but his hands also heal. Talking about God. God does allow things to come along that wound us, that injure us. But he doesn't leave us there. He's not just a mean God that does things to us. Things are allowed in our lives. We face problems, but he heals us. He soothes the wound. 20, in famine he will rescue you from death, and in battle from the stroke of the sword. You will be protected from the lash of the tongue, and need not fear when destruction comes. You will laugh at destruction and famine, and need not fear the beasts of the earth. For you will have a covenant with the stones of the field, and the wild animals will be at peace with you. You will know that your tent is secure. You will take stock of your property and find nothing missing. You will know that your children will be many, and your descendants like the grass of the earth. You will come to the grave in full vigor, like sheaves gathered in season. We have examined this, and it is true, so hear it and apply it to yourself. So in all of that, it sounds pretty positive, and it's true that as all of us yield ourselves to God, yield our lives to Him, God will pour out blessings. Doesn't mean trouble never comes, but He's always there. Romans 5:8. But God, and we know that all things work together for good for them that love the Lord and are called according to His purpose. God can take something bad in our lives and transform it to something good. He can heal a wound and make it stronger than before. He does all these things, and that's what Eliphaz is saying to here. And he's saying it to Job because his underlining idea is Job must have sinned for all this trouble to come on him. That he is certain that that's what happened. So he makes his appeal. He gives that assurance that if Job will confess, God will make everything all right. And so that's where he leaves it. But underlying all that, Eliphaz is saying, Job, you've messed up. You need to confess. And so then we get to Job's response to Eliphaz. And he makes an appeal, and it's pretty much an appeal because he's talking to his friends, and he's asking them to have some understanding. His friends didn't feel the heaviness of his suffering. Yes, they came, they sat in the ashes, they tore their robes, they waited in silence, but they're not really feeling the heaviness. And we can understand that. It's hard for us to truly feel somebody else's pain. See it? Depending on how close we are, there are times it can break our heart as well. But it's hard for us. And his friends didn't felt the heaviness of his suffering, that they didn't understand the bitterness of his suffering. Job did have some bitterness here. He didn't know why this was happening to him. He ascribes it all to God because he ascribes all things coming from God. But he doesn't blaspheme God. He doesn't curse God. He just says God can do what He wants. Remember that verse we studied? I came into this world naked, I'll go out. The Lord has made me wealthy, the Lord takes away the wealth. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He is one person that really understood and saw himself firmly ensconced in God's hands. And he believed in the power of God, he believed in the goodness of God, he believed in the mercy of God, And even when things went all wrong, he knew he was better off being united with God than against him, than cursing him. And so he's wishing his friends understood his bitterness. And we need that understanding of people around us. We may not, even if we don't agree with it, even if it's wrong, okay? There are things as we get to know people and they have habits and behaviors that aren't what they should be. If we know something about them, where they come from, what we're struggling with, it doesn't make what they're doing right, but it can give us understanding that they're not just being wicked, evil people. They're responding to a negative in their life. They may have grown up without good parents, without a good father, without parents at all, really. They may have grown up in hardship. We've got people in our midst who grew up with virtually nothing, were hungry and struggled. Their dad left, different things like this. All of that impacts your view of life. It impacts your view of God. I've shared with you a story about when I was leading Vacation Bible School to you in a class down in Georgia, and I asked the young people, and they were preteens, I'd say, to draw a picture depicting what they thought of God. Now I knew it was going to be real abstract. I knew it was going to be who knows what, because none of us have seen God in that way that we can paint Him. Well, this one picture is turned into me, and it's very obvious that this young woman had represented as God is being abusive to people. And of course that concerned me. Where on earth she would get that image? So I went and talked to my pastor, shared with him. He said, yes, I'm aware there's that problem in the household. This young woman had a father who was abusive. I don't know what kind of abuse. Don't let your mind run too rampant. There are many kinds, but he was abusive, and the pastor knew that. And of course I had to leave it with the pastor. It wasn't my concern. But I did let him know, and he was aware of it, doing what he knew to do. People grow up with that kind of hardship in life, and it does impact how we relate to other people. If you have a father like that, it's easy to understand why you would not see God in a good light. If your experience is a father who uses the money instead of feeding you, who gambles away the money instead of clothing you, who is abusive to you, whether it's verbal or however, that is your representation of a father. And when somebody comes and talks to you, God the Father, it's natural to transfer those things. We have to help them see about how God is a good Father, how He doesn't do those things. But all of us can be molded by those tapes in our head, by little things that are said, maybe in passing, but they stick with you. And so Job is wanting them to understand his bitterness. His friends didn't feel his hopelessness. Job didn't know what he could do. He was living the righteous life. He was doing what he knew to do before God. And things were going well. He was been blessed. Now, out of the blue, everything is taken away except his life. All of his goods, all of his children, and his body is covered with sores. And he's going to say, I didn't change. Have you ever had that thing where all of a sudden trouble comes on you? You know that you didn't change what you're doing, but all of a sudden maybe somebody is coming against you, and you don't understand. You hadn't done anything to them. Those times come. Well, that's where Job is feeling, and he's believing it came from God. So he's saying, what can I do? You can't counsel God. You can't sit God in a corner and tell him to start acting right. So he's feeling this hopelessness of having nothing that he can do to make the situation better. But he's feeling like, and I think he's accurate, that his friends just aren't understanding the depth of his hopelessness, because they're coming in really with easy platitudes. It's easy, Job. You've just sinned. You just need to confess your sin. It'll all be better. Well, that wasn't the case. They were wrong in that in the first place, and it would not have done that. It would not have turned things around because that wasn't the situation. Certainly, if Job had committed a sin and God was disciplining him for that sin and he confessed it, then yes, that would turn it around. But he was a righteous person. He was doing right, and this trouble comes on him. And as we mentioned last week, he doesn't know the whole story. He doesn't know that it's Satan instigating God to do these things, that Satan actually did it, but God allowing him. He doesn't know. All he knows is, I'm living my life. One day I'm fat, dumb, and happy. The next day I'm told everybody's almost dead, all my family, and I'm covered with sores. That's a pretty hopeless situation that he's feeling. And so what can he do? That hopelessness. And hearkening back to my sermon on Sunday, hope really is what keeps us going sometimes. Right. Sometimes it's all we have is that tomorrow will be a better day. That's the only way we can get up the next day, is that something's going to be better. We have to have that hope. And hopelessness, like he was feeling, leads to usefulness. He thought he was living, and he was living the right life. He was living a righteous life. But now he's stricken down. Well, if he was living the righteous life and this happened, then what can I do? I'm useless. I have nothing I can do. And I think that maybe hits men harder than women. We take a lot of stock in our personal value, how we feel our esteem by what we can do, that we can take care of another person, that we can provide for them. That's why work is so important to us, because that's how we accomplish what we need to do. And when there is a sickness that goes on, a loved one that we can't do anything with, you feel useless, don't you? I can't help, I can't do anything to change this. And you wish that you could. You'd give anything to be able to make it right. So that hopelessness leads to feeling useless. And that's an awful, awful feeling, that we have nothing to offer, nothing to bear. So this is what he's dealing with. He's really pouring out his heart to his friends about how much he's hurting. And then he pointed out the ineffectiveness of their ministry. In other words, what they're saying. What they're saying just was too simple. It was a simple attitude. It wasn't all-encompassing. They were limiting God. They thought they knew exactly how God worked, that God was black or white, that if this happens, God does that. If that happens, God does this. And it's just not the way things work. And here God had done something that they were totally unaware of. They didn't imagine God would do. It was totally beyond their realm of understanding. And they naturally were stuck to what they understood rather than believing their friend and saying with him, okay, God, what are you doing here? So Job talks to him in this way, that they didn't feel the heaviness of his suffering. They didn't understand the bitterness of his heart, and they didn't understand his hopelessness, and what they were saying was just like spitting in the wind. It just wasn't doing any good. It wasn't any benefit. And so that's Job's response on that. Then he gets in directly to his response to Eliphaz, and it goes into chapter 9. He describes the futility of life. That's what he was feeling like. He thought he was doing things. He thought he had it figured out. But then now he's as destitute as anybody. He's as bad off as anyone. So his life seems futile. He focuses on the brevity of life. And the Bible talks about that a lot in the Psalms. It talks about how we are a vapor. And, you know, we can celebrate people who live to be 100 years old, who survive that long, don't have a disease that kills them, don't have a habit that puts them in the grave. But that 100 years which is a long time. I can't imagine being able to remember things, say from 90 years ago when I was a 10-year-old boy. I can't imagine that. And there are people who have longer memories. But in the scheme of eternity, it's nothing. It's a wisp. It's so short. It doesn't even blip, not even a blip on the timeline. And Job is feeling the weight of being in God's crosshairs. He feels like he's got a target on him, and all of this is happening to him. I'm sure he's not seeing anyone around him. Some ways, maybe there he's been a little self-centered, because a lot of people were impacted. A lot of his servants were killed. Those servants had families. Those servants had jobs. They earned money that took care of their family. That food fed people. Other people were impacted greatly, which is a good side lesson to us. When we commit a sin that causes God to act in that way, it impacts other people. Even if it's a small one within our family. If dads, when we do something that gets God turned against us to pull his hand of blessing, it doesn't just impact us. It impacts our loved ones. And that should be a motivation for us to work on being righteous, because it doesn't just impact us, it impacts others. And so he's feeling that weight of God, just having him in his crosshairs. Everything that's coming is happening to him. And he certainly had more happen to him than I ever want to have happen to me. And I don't want to be tested this way. So Satan, don't come around egging God on, okay? Then we go down to the last one. Job pleads for forgiveness. And it's important we understand what he's doing here. He isn't confessing a sin he committed that he knows is against God. What he's doing, he's opening himself up. How we can relate. We try to live our life as best we know how. And yet there are times we're laying in our bed that if we need to do this, we need to say, Lord, reveal anything in me that is not according to your will. Because we may not see it. We just don't see things sometimes. And that's what Job is doing here. He's not saying, yes, I've committed sins, and he's admitting that sin, but he is yielding himself, saying, Lord, I am an open book to you. Show me where I've sinned, which shows us his heart, because once God had done that, he would have repented from it. He would have changed. And that is a pure heart. That's a whole heart for God. That's the heart that David had. David sinned grievously, and he paid consequences for that. But when Nathan pointed out to him his sin, he fell down in weeping and mourning and pleading before God to cleanse his sin. And God did. God accepted him. And so that's what Job is doing here. He's just opening himself up, saying, Lord, I'm your servant, I'm yours. Whatever there is in my life that needs to be changed, Lord, tell me. So that's the kind of forgiveness he's asking for here. He is not giving in to what they're saying, that he's committed a sin. And one of the other things that was brought out in my studies here is what Eliphaz recommended him do was really in the same keeping of what Satan was saying Job would do. Satan said, you take away all this stuff from him, he'll curse you, God. Eliphaz is saying, you've done wrong, curse God and die, or forgive your sin. He's saying much the same thing that Satan has. And if Job, in this condition, had believed Eliphaz or the other two, if he had gotten convinced that he had some sin and confessed what he didn't do to God, then he'd have really upset what God was proving. God, of course, he couldn't upset it because God knew who Job was. But if you see that point, that if he had agreed about his sin, if he had taken that path, then basically he's saying, well, God, you were wrong. I'm not as good as you think I am. And he would have proven Satan's point that when he had trouble, he would turn against God. And so if he had followed his friend's advice, he would have been denying God and his love and his power and his goodness. And so that is very important there about how he did not do that, because he would have really been proving Satan right if he had confessed sin like they wanted him to. And sometimes we do that. Sue has told me a story of her high school in Kenya, RVA, and she was going down a hall, and the lady, if I remember right, Sue, the details aren't so important, but the lady was convinced Sue had opened a door or done something, and she just would not let it go. Sue told her, no, I didn't do that. She would not let it go, and the only way Sue found that she could get the lady to stop to say, yes, I did it, was to confess to something she hadn't done. That got the lady off her back. There was punishment, but it got the lady off her back because she would not believe that Sue had not done what she was being accused of. And so we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that before God. We shouldn't have to do that. We stand true. We stand to our integrity as God does that. I think I'm going to stop now before we go on. Next, we'll go into Bildad, and we want to be able to do Bildad and Job's response. We don't have time to do all of that tonight. So we'll stop here with Eliphaz and with Job. And I want to stop with a question, though. All of these people, even though they had some misconceptions about God, his friends, all of them show a very deep reverence for God. They believe God does come justice against sin, that people need to live right by him. They show a real deep, where did it come from? They didn't have the Ten Commandments. They didn't have anything written. They didn't have priests or prophets. How did they know God in this way? How did Job know God in this way? What do you think? What can you imagine? Okay, that's part of it, yep.
God can make himself known to us just through his creation.
Right, that's right. He says that. I think there's more to it. Remember, we said Job was written as the oldest written book in the Bible, and that he lived back with the patriarchs, which was Abraham and his children. These guys heard these stories passed down over generations. Adam would have told to his children about who God was, about all of. They knew God from that. So they actually, it's that de-evolution word I used several weeks back. They started with a close relationship with God. They were close to when he created things. All of that was fresh in their minds. And those stories, the way they passed things down was by stories, person to person. These stories were very real to them. Their great-granddaddy would tell maybe, some of these things that had happened that they experienced, okay? And so I believe that's really where their knowledge came from. Yes, God through his Spirit can impress upon them himself, but I think they came from a new people who really had been on earth with God and seen him and passed these stories. Again, and maybe I need to write this up for us, to where when you take the genealogies, when it tells how long Adam lived, how long Esau lived, and all of these, and you see how they overlap. Because they lived up to almost 1,000 years. Methuselah was 900 and something years old. That means they lived when a lot of those other people were alive, and they would have heard the stories firsthand. And that's about the most convincing thing. They had the stars to corroborate it. They had God's Spirit to corroborate it, but they had the stories. And maybe you can remember a story your parents told you from World War II or something. Or, David, some stories you've told your children or grandchildren about Vietnam. They can read it in a book, but Paul was there. He lived it. The difference, the power of that. And that's where I think they were. They had pawpaws and meemaws that were that much closer to God, and they passed down these stories about who God is, how good He is. That, to me, makes a lot of sense about how they would have had this devotion to God. And later, God had to kind of reveal Himself. He walked with Adam. I don't know how He did that, walked in the garden with Adam. But Adam was perfect. He had no sin, so God could have that fellowship. But they experienced that. And then it got lost because of sin. And over time, that sin took more and more root, like a cancer. It gradually takes over your body and consumes it. Well, that's what sin's done. So then God needed to start reintroducing Himself, retelling Himself. And that culminated in Jesus Christ dying on the cross. And so that's what we see happening. And what's going to happen as we progress on, at some point, whether it's here, there, or in the air, we're going to get back to being in fellowship and in a relationship with God, and then we will know Him. Paul talks about that in Romans and Corinthians mainly, that even that I shall fully know, even as I am fully known. God fully knows us. Well, on that day that we are resurrected into His kingdom, whether it's our last breath or whether it's when He comes, and we'll be in His presence, we will fully know God. We will experience Him firsthand at that point. So we started out, humanity did, walking with God, knowing God as a friend that He walked in the garden. We lost that. We went into the depths of sin. And then we came up, Jesus showed us a picture, a new picture, a picture that gives us hope and joy, a way to live. And then that promise that we'll talk about Easter Sunday of the resurrection, when we will once again fully be known by God, and in God's presence we will fully know all the things we've looked for and hoped for. That's amazing. Looking forward to that. But I do think that I've been pondering on that. How did they have this worship of God? How did they have? There weren't any. Billy Graham wasn't around then. D.L. Moody, none of these people. I believe because they had first-hand stories of God working in their ancestors' lives, and that was powerful.